shir usually works wherever I speak is that we'll deal with all the questions and answers that are presented here, and then at the end of the presentation we'll have room for questions and answers. The first question on the list is, when is it okay to walk into a McDonald's to buy a Coke? That's a frequently asked question, believe it or not. When you're traveling on the road, you hit a road stop, and you're thirsty. And you want to know if you can buy a Coke at a McDonald's. Or a coffee. That question really is related to maris ayin, or marat ayin. And that means, in English, doing something that is permitted, but people think that you're doing something which is not permitted. For example, walking into a non-kosher restaurant. People will say, wait a second, there's a Jewish person walking into a non-kosher restaurant. That is marat ayin. That's doing something which people may think you're doing something wrong. And there's a discussion in the Code of Jewish Law, whether that applies to cooking meat and non-dairy milk together, because we know the rabbis say you're not allowed to cook milk and meat together, and that's one of the prohibitions listed in the Chumash. You're not allowed to cook milk and meat together. What about if you use non-dairy milk? So the rabbis there say that that shouldn't be done because of maris ayin. However, they say that if you put almonds on the table, and indicating that the milk is made from these almonds, then that will be permitted because people passing by will realize that it's not real milk, and there's no issue of maris ayin because it's not real milk and meat, it's meat and parva milk or non-dairy milk. There's a response coming out of Eretz Israel, by the name of Chacham Avad Yosef. And he maintains that nowadays you don't have to start putting out containers of milk. Imagine you're going to a wedding and they're serving non-dairy ice cream at a meat meal, and people will say, wow, it looks like real ice cream. Do you have to put a container, or nowadays equivalent to almonds, on the table? He maintains that being that nowadays everyone knows that there's non-dairy ice cream, or for that matter, there's non-dairy creamer with your coffee. So even though on Shabbos you had a meat meal and now you want to have a coffee with a non-dairy creamer, you don't have to start putting out a package with a non-dairy creamer for your guests to make sure that they don't think you're doing anything wrong, because it's common nowadays for people to put those items on the table, and being that it's so common, there's no need to put out the almonds or the equivalent of the almonds, the package, on the table nowadays. And this comes back to the question regarding walking into a McDonald's. Everyone knows nowadays that there's rest stops and there's rest areas such as McDonald's or other non-kosher establishments, and people don't go in there to buy non-kosher food. They're going to use the restroom, they're going to buy coffee, or they're going to buy a bottle of Coke. And therefore, being that everyone knows about it nowadays, there's no issue of maris ayin, and you're allowed to be able to go into a McDonald's and buy a water, use the bathroom, and there would be no issues regarding that. One thing I would suggest, that if you're going to McDonald's and buying a water or using the restrooms, regarding the water or the soda, you shouldn't sit in the window by McDonald's and people pass by and see that you're actually sitting in the store, because that might be an issue of maris ayin. People will think that there's something maybe non-kosher on your plate. But if you want to buy the item, there's nothing wrong with buying the item and going into the car and drinking it in your car. The question is, if you're allowed to go into a vegan restaurant, assuming obviously there's no kosher certification, and what issues can come up regarding that. In order to understand that question, you really have to backtrack and understand the halachas of Bishul Akum. And that means that a non-Jewish person is not allowed to cook something for a Jew. And that halacha is brought down in the Code of Jewish Law, in Yeridea, chapter 113. And there the rabbis tell us that you're not allowed to have a non-Jew cook for you, and it's primarily two reasons. One is because we're concerned that if a non-Jewish person cooks for you, cooking is usually is a social gathering, and people will come to become close, and the rabbis were concerned of intermarriage between a Jew and a non-Jew, and therefore the rabbis say a non-Jew cannot cook for a Jew. The other reason is because we're concerned that the non-Jew will put in some non-kosher food into the item and serve it to the Jew. So therefore, because of that reason, and because of the reason of intermarriage, primarily the reason is because of intermarriage, you're not allowed to have a non-Jewish person cook for you. There's two exceptions. One exception is something which is not fit to be served on the king's table. And now the equivalent to that is you go to a wedding and you see something on a smorgasbord. So anything that's on a smorgasbord nowadays would not be able to be cooked by a non-Jew, because that's an important meal, important food. And the Rambam, Maimonides, maintains that anytime you have a food where you're going to invite somebody for to your house, that's an issue of Bishul Akum. You're not allowed to have a non-Jewish person cook for you. But if it's a snack item, there will be no concern regarding that. The other exception is something which is edible raw. You take an apple, for example, you can eat it raw. So therefore, if a non-Jewish person cooks an apple for you, the non-Jewish person is not doing anything for you. So there's no concern of Bishul Akum regarding that. The other introduction, before we answer the question regarding a vegan restaurant, is another halacha, another Jewish law, which is codified in the Code of Jewish Law, and that is referred to insects. The rabbis tell us that you're not allowed to consume insects, and the truth is there may be 6 or 7 prohibitions related to consuming insects. And that's why we have many pre-washed vegetables, or many of the Kashrut agencies have recommendations on how to wash insect-infested items such as strawberries. And other berries are not recommended at all, such as raspberries and blackberries, due to the high infestation level of these bugs, and they're very hard to clean. Now people ask, I don't understand, 30, 40 years ago there was no issue of bugs, now all of a sudden there's a new bug issue, what's going on? The truth is, the government used to allow a pesticide called DDA, and at that point it was so effective that it was killing people as well as the bugs. And because of that, the government outlawed the usage of DDA, and because of that, the pesticides and the other insects, pesticides were ineffective, and the insects came back. And that's why the insects are commonly found on romaine lettuce, on strawberries, on raspberries, blackberries, and many other such items. With this introduction, we can understand the question number 2, and that is, can one eat in a vegan restaurant without any kosher supervision? Well, in a vegan restaurant, they're still going to cook the product for you. Even though it's vegan and there's no meat in there, there's still going to be an issue of Bishul Akum, because usually you're going to go to a restaurant, you'll have a nice dish, and that dish can be an issue of a non-Jewish person cooking for you. If you have a Jewish restaurant, there's a rabbi there at all times, lighting the fires, making sure that all the food meets the requirements that are supposed to be there according to the Jewish law. And furthermore, even though it might be vegan, there are many issues of insects. Is the lettuce washed out properly? Are they using fresh broccoli, which is a problem of insects? And being that there's so many issues regarding insects and Bishul Akum, and obviously there's other ingredients which may not be kosher in the sauces or whatever they're using, a person would not be able to walk into a vegan restaurant without any kosher certification. Many times, a person wants a little boost of caffeine in the morning, and he wants to know if he can go into any Dunkin' Donuts and buy products in Dunkin' Donuts. The way Dunkin' Donuts works, primarily, is that each Dunkin' Donuts store do not bake on premises. They have what they call a satellite bakery. Either the owner of an individual Dunkin' Donuts has a satellite bakery, or a few owners get together and they have one central satellite bakery, and they bake all the items at that facility. So the question comes up many times, you want a coffee, but with your coffee you want a muffin, you want a donut, what could be wrong with it? Now even if you were to argue and say that you found out that the satellite bakery is kosher, they use all the kosher oils and all the mixes that they use are kosher for the donuts, that may be true, but the deep fryer that they use for the donuts can many times be used for other non-kosher items that they want to deep fry on the same deep fryer. So unless you're stuck in the desert somewhere and you have nothing to eat, it's not advisable to purchase donuts from Dunkin' Donuts unless the store is under a rabbinical certification. In regards to the coffee, most of the flavors, if not by now all the flavors of Dunkin' Donuts are certified kosher. And being that all the flavors are kosher certified, there would not seem to be any issue with going into a Dunkin' Donuts and purchasing a coffee from their coffee dispenser. Now, if you know of a certain flavor which is not kosher certified, obviously you should make sure at that point that only purchase the kosher certified flavors. If you want to order a plain coffee, so a plain coffee is kosher certified anywhere. You want to go to a rest stop, you want to go to Dunkin' Donuts, you want to go to any such location, you would be able to buy unflavored coffee, because unflavored coffee is not any issue regarding the kashrut status. Once we're on the topic of coffee, seems to be a hot item. People want to know if they go into Starbucks. Starbucks had an issue, and still does have issues in many of them, regarding their sale of non-kosher items. Many times they'll have salads or other kinds of dishes that they manufacture or they make in the store, and they clean that many times with the same coffee dispensers, and they use the same dishwasher. So it's about a 30 to 40 page discussion in one of the rabbinical literatures regarding the usage and the permissibility of going into a Starbucks store. They differentiate between a regular kiosk like in the airport where there's no cooking of any other non-kosher, or a regular store where they don't recommend buying certain types of coffee. It is recommended maybe after the shir and the lecture, we'll be able to refer you to that website to be able to check up and read the article in depth, and that will be able to do justice regarding going into the Starbucks and purchasing items there. People have often asked me many times you go into a supermarket and you see a new flavor of mouthwash or toothpaste. And does this item really have to be kosher certified? The truth is, there is differing opinions. It's brought down in the Code of Jewish Law in Yeridea, chapter 98, that you shouldn't take something which is forbidden, even rabbinically, in your mouth, and even if you're going to spit it out. So according to that, some rabbis say if you take mouthwash, which has a lot of glycerin, and glycerin is the non-kosher component in mouthwash, 50% of the time it's going to be kosher, and 50% of the time it's not going to be kosher, depending upon what's available, because glycerin is a commodity. Whatever they can get on the market, they'll purchase, and whatever's cheaper is what the companies are going to put into their products. So being that glycerin could be non-kosher 50% of the time, even though the company will say we don't use animal glycerin, it's very hard to believe many of the times when the companies tell you that. And there are some rabbis who maintain that you should not take those items in your mouth, but the truth is, the overwhelming majority of rabbis and codifiers of Jewish law maintain that mouthwash is not necessarily a food item. You don't eat mouthwash. So being that you don't eat mouthwash, you're allowed to use the mouthwash, you spit it out primarily, you're not going to swallow it. It even tells you that it's alcohol-based, and you should not put it in your mouth to swallow. And being that it's not a food item, you would be able to use the mouthwash, even though it doesn't have a rabbinical certification on there. Now, there is some thoughts to say that still they don't want to take something which is forbidden, even though rabbinically in your mouth, and that's why you do have people who are careful to only use mouthwash with rabbinical certification. There are rabbinical supervised mouthwashes that have certifications from the national certifications. So if a person does want to be stringent, you do have those available on the market, but again, many of the rabbis maintain that there's no concern and you would be able to purchase those items even though it doesn't have a kosher certification. Now our discussion turns to toothpaste. The way they used to make toothpaste until about 7-8 years ago is they took calcium carbonate, which is basically, I don't know if you remember your school days, they take chalk and they write it on the board. So that type of calcium carbonate, they crush that and they put some flavoring into it. They make it into a paste, and there you have your toothpaste. The glycerin, which we just spoke about a few moments ago, was and still is put into the mouthwash and put into the toothpaste as well. For Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, who was a rabbi who lived about 20 years ago, he maintained that being that most of the items in the toothpaste are not food ingredients, they're calcium carbonate and other kinds of abrasives to make your mouth clean, he maintained that the glycerin in there is not an issue because most of the ingredients are not food items. However, about 4 or 5 years ago, that changed. And the way they make toothpaste, is they take hydrated silica, which is basically sand, and they add different ingredients in there to make it more palatable, and to put it in your mouth, they'll add the flavors, and you'll have your toothpaste. But now the glycerin is much higher percentage. So the same line of reasoning that said that you shouldn't put anything which is forbidden in your mouth by mouthwash still maintain that regarding toothpaste. And there are rabbis who maintain that you would have to require certification on toothpaste. But the overwhelming majority is that, again, toothpaste and mouthwash are not food items. You don't take it in your mouth, it's not meant to be eaten. And because of that, you would not have to have certification on those items, and you would be able to buy your Crest or your Colgate or any other kind of toothpaste that you currently use. Once we're on the topic of mouthwash, there are different varieties of mouthwash. There's Listerine and there's Scope, and Listerine came out with the item about a few years ago regarding kosher status, and that is Listerine pocket packs. Many times you'll find that in the drugstores, the Listerine pocket packs, and the question came up regarding a blessing on those items. We know that mouthwash and toothpaste is not a food item, but I spoke to a representative about 3-4 years ago, and they went through all the ingredients with me, and they said that all the ingredients in Listerine pocket packs are, in fact, food-grade ingredients, and you're supposed to swallow it because you're doing it to make your mouth taste a little minty or whatever kind of flavor you're taking into your mouth. And because of that, if a person is really doing it because he likes the flavor, is it a mint flavor, and he's eating it like a candy, it would require a bracha, a blessing of shahakal. But most of the times, people who are taking the Listerine pocket packs are just doing it to get their mouth feel, and not necessarily doing it like a candy. And therefore, if a person is not doing it for that reason, no blessing would be recited. So it's really up to each individual person's own preference what the reason is that he's using these pocket pack items.
Excuse me, the Listerine pocket packs are kosher?
Yeah, the Listerine pocket packs are kosher. They have a Kof K. You're walking in the street, and it's a hot day, and you pass a 7-Eleven. You're probably going to end up passing one of the 14,000 or so 7-Elevens sometime, in your day. And the question is regarding purchasing a Slurpee. Now the truth is, I was in contact with 7-Eleven for many, many months regarding Slurpees and how they operate and the possibility of us monitoring some of the Slurpee machines in the stores. The reason is because they have about 6 flavors which are not kosher certified, and many rabbis tell their students, we're not sure exactly how the machine operates, maybe they're using the same hose, and maybe they don't wash it out in between, and the flavor that you're getting, even though it's kosher, may have some non-kosher components left in the hose, and now you're going to get it in your cup. And because of that, rabbis are telling their students not to go to 7-Eleven. So I researched it for a few months, back and forth, and it turns out that many of the 7-Eleven machines, even though maybe the old ones used to have different methods of operating, they all have separate hoses. That means a non-kosher flavor is not going to mix up with the kosher flavor. Now, even though many people don't feel comfortable enough with that, and they still feel that some of the non-kosher components would mix into the kosher flavors, there's enough to rely on to go to a 7-Eleven and purchase a Slurpee, even though it doesn't necessarily have a kosher symbol on the machine stating that this machine is kosher certified. As long as you look at the list of the different kosher agencies that provide the list stating that this flavor is kosher, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with going into a 7-Eleven to buy a Slurpee. If a person wants to be stringent, obviously, and doesn't feel comfortable enough, then you could be stringent. But again, most of the people you see walk around nowadays, the Jewish people are looking into the stores, little kids, everyone's buying Slurpees, and that's what they're relying on, the fact that they're buying the kosher flavor and it's not necessarily mixing in with your non-kosher flavor in the same machine. In New York, it's very common. In Massachusetts also, it's pretty common to see a certification on a Pepsi. In New York, you'll have a Kof K. In other states, you'll have different certifications. And the question is, are you allowed to purchase such items without kosher certification? The way Pepsi works is the following. The flavors come in from different countries under a certification, and they come into the bottling plants at each location, whether it's a bottling plant in New York, whether it's a bottling plant in a different state, and the syrups are kosher certified. Now, when you have a bottling plant that's under certification, that certification means that the rabbis are going into the plant, making sure that the syrup goes into the holding tank, they add all the sugar in there and all the other flavors and ingredients, and they make sure that there's only kosher products going into the bottling facility, or they're monitoring to making sure that the cleaning systems that are in place meet kosher standards. And that's when you'll have a kashrut symbol on a Pepsi product. Pepsi uses the same ingredients, whether it's in New York State or Massachusetts. They're all going to use the same ingredients because they have licenses signed with all the different vendors that once they order an ingredient, that's going to be that same ingredient. And therefore, if New York is using a certain sugar or a certain ingredient, they'll have the same exact ingredient in another state. And the way they bottle Pepsi is they don't use any heat in the bottling of Pepsi products. It's all bottled cold. And we know in Jewish law, when you have cold mixing together, as long as it's washed out properly and there's nothing left in the tank, there's no concern. And being that there's no heat involved, it's all cold, there does not seem to be any concern with purchasing a Pepsi product as long as it says made under the Pepsi Bottling Authority. There are two exceptions. One is Hawaiian Punch, and the other one is Welch's grape juice, or any other grape soda. The reason is because Hawaiian Punch, the larger bottles that you buy, let's say in the larger stores like BJ's or Costco, those are pasteurized. And pasteurization means that it goes under an oven about 180 degrees or so. And if the bottling plant is not under certification, we have no way of knowing what is going to be bottled in the same pasteurizer or go through the same pasteurizer. And because of that, Hawaiian Punch would not be able to be purchased unless you know it has a rabbinical certification on the cap. The other exception is Welch's grape juice, and that because there's issues of Yayin Nesef, which we don't have time to go into tonight. But basically, Yayin Nesef means that a non-Jewish person cannot touch any aspects of certain wine products. And when you have Welch's grape juice, many times you could have some issues regarding wine, and if it doesn't have a rabbinical certification on there, you would not be able to purchase the Welch's grape juice items because of that concern. You go into a supermarket and you see different labels. You see a Kof K dairy, or you see a Kof K DE. And the question is, what do all these labels mean? You see a Kof K Glock, a Kof K fish. There's many different labeling issues. Or many times you go to a supermarket and see Kof K dairy, but it's not a dairy item. There's no dairy ingredients in there. So in order to understand these common questions, we really have to backtrack and visit a basic muffin facility. You go into a muffin facility, let's say it's a dairy muffin facility. The way it works is they'll take the muffin mix, which is dairy, they'll put it in their muffin molds, they'll put it in the oven, and they'll bake it at whatever temperature they're baking it. Being that that ingredient in there is dairy, because we're talking about dairy muffins, that oven is going to have the status of dairy, because there's milk in the muffin mix. Now what happens if the company says, you know, we don't want to have a dairy item, we want to have a parve item, a non-dairy item. So they take out the milk ingredient from the mix, and they're only using non-dairy products for their muffins. When that happens, they have to have a rabbi come down to the facility and what we call kosherize the ovens. Because now the ovens had the dairy component in there, and in order to get the dairy component out, we have to kosherize the ovens. To kosherize the ovens, you have to have a 24-hour downtime. The company has to be down for 24 hours. They can't produce any items for 24 hours. They have the rabbi come down there. They make sure all the items are clean, all the trays are clean, the oven is cleaned out, and then you'll have your parve products. You'll have a Kof K parve or any other kosher agency that you eat. Either they're kosherizing the ovens, or the plant that they manufacture the product has no dairy in it, and it was always considered parve. But companies say, you know what, it's a very good idea to have parve, and it's great. We want to have a variety of products. But we have to be down for 24 hours. And when we're down for 24 hours, that means we're not making any money. Companies like ovens operate, and I go to plenty of companies that they say the ovens are never down, because they can't afford to shut down the ovens. Because if the ovens are not producing or products aren't going through there, that means they're losing money. So the companies don't want to have any downtime, as they call it, and they want the ovens to be operating all the time. Well, if they want to make their power product, that won't be able to work because you need 24 hours downtime. So the company says, okay, fine. We don't want the product to be parve, we want it to be dairy equipment. And what dairy equipment means is that there's no dairy actually in the muffin mix, for example, going back to our muffin case, but it's being used in a dairy oven, it's being baked in a dairy oven. So they make sure all the, obviously all the any residue is in the oven is out of the oven, they clean it properly, and they don't have to have downtime for that, as much as they were doing a 24-hour downtime. So they take all the products out, they make sure everything is clean, and they have a product which is dairy equipment. In the Code of Jewish Law it says, parenthetically, that you're not allowed to eat an item which is cooked in a dairy equipment together with meat. So if you take an item which says DE, which stands for dairy equipment, you will not be able to eat that together with your meat dish. You can either have it before or after. And that applies primarily to Ashkenazim. For Sephardim, the law is a little different, but primarily for Ashkenazim, you'll not be able to have it together with your meat dish. So many times when you see that on your package, it'll stand for dairy equipment. DE stands for dairy equipment, meaning there's no actual dairy in there, but it is made on dairy equipment. When you see an item that says dairy, but there's no dairy ingredients, there's no milk or any other kind of ingredient, the truth is that even though you don't necessarily recognize an ingredient because there's no milk in there, there's many other ingredients that actually could come from milk, especially when you deal with flavors. When it says natural butter flavor, it actually could be dairy, even though you don't see a milk ingredient in there. When you deal with flavors, there could be hundreds of ingredients in that flavor to make it a natural butter flavor. So even though you do have a Kof K dairy and you're thinking to yourself what kind of dairy could be in here, it doesn't look like there's any dairy ingredients in there, it can in fact be a dairy product. And the other way a product can be dairy is when the machine is not cleaned out properly enough and we don't feel comfortable enough labeling it as DE, or dairy equipment, so there could be some residue left in the packaging and in the equipment in the oven, and that's why it'll be considered dairy. Once we're in the topics of labels, it's very common to find on a package that says made in the same equipment as shellfish, or made in the same equipment as dairy. And you want to know now, if you take your onions, for example, and put that in your meat dish, it says made in the same equipment as dairy. So many women call me up and they say, I want to use these onions for a meat dish, how am I supposed to use it if it says made in the same equipment as dairy? Or people call me up and say, if you're a kosher agency, why are you certifying items that says made in the same equipment as shellfish? As we know, shellfish is not a kosher fish. The answer to that is because the federal government requires that anytime you have an allergen in a factory, it has to be stated on the label, even though it could be there in parts per million, which according to Jewish law, anytime you have 60 times the amount of kosher ingredients, it's going to be nullified. For sure, if it's parts per million, there's not going to be any concern of kosher status. But still, the federal government requires it for allergen purposes. So if you want to take your onions, which says made in the same equipment as dairy or may contain dairy, there would be no concern with putting it on your products as long as the item says Arab on it. It's not going to say DE. Because obviously if it says DE, then we're back to our previous discussion. There's a halacha in the Jewish law that is known as pas paltar. Pas paltar means the following. These halachas are codified in Yeridea in chapter 112, and it says that a non-Jewish person is not allowed to bake bread for a Jew. However, if it's done for commercial purposes, for example, you take your stromans, your freihoffers, bread products, then it will be permitted. However, there is a discussion between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. Let's say you live in this town where you have a kosher bakery. And if it's a kosher bakery, then maybe you have what we call Pas Israel, where a Jewish person is lighting the fires, just like we had Bishul Akum, that a Jewish person lights the fire. So the same thing applies to Pas Israel, Pas Yisrael. And if you have a bakery in the neighborhood which has that arrangement in place, maybe you wouldn't be able to buy your stromans and your freihoffers items, because that's known as Pas Paltar. Made by Paltar means a baker for large purposes, commercial purposes, and maybe that will not be permitted. The Shulchan Aruch in chapter 112 maintains that if you have a local bakery that sells Pas Israel, Pas Yisrael products, then you would not be able to buy your Pas Paltar products, so your stromans and freihoffers. But luckily, we have the Ramah. And the Ramah maintains that even if you have a local bakery that has Pas Yisrael, Pas Israel products, you can still buy your stromans and your freihoffers or any other such item that we call and categorize as Pas Paltar, or Pas made by a commercial bakery. There are certain times of the year where it's brought down in Jewish law that you shouldn't have such items, such as the 10 days of repentance between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And some people bring down other times of the year, but primarily it would be permitted to purchase Pas Paltar throughout the year, and there are many authorities that maintain that doing so is permitted all year round, except for those few times, a few days during the year. Now, even if somebody is concerned and says, no, we only want to have Pas Israel, and we don't want to have any bread baked by a non-Jew, even though it obviously has a kosher certification on there, there is another law brought down in chapter 112, subsection 5, that maintains that anytime you have a bread, let's say a very high-end bread or a whole wheat bread, that's only available by Pas Paltar, and it's not available by a Jewish baker, then you would be able to have your product. So many times people are into healthy breads, or any whole wheat, or has extra fiber, anything that has added health benefits to the bread will be permitted in using that bread, even if you're concerned and you say, no, you only really want to have a Pas Israel product. Many times if you go into a supermarket and you go to ShopRite or any other kind of Stop and Shop, which is probably very common in Massachusetts, and you'll have a bread product, and you pick it up and you say, is this Pas Israel? The truth is, most of the supermarket chains are private labels, which means that Stop and Shop and all these larger supermarket chains, whether it's Shaw's or any other kind of chain, doesn't have their own baking facilities. They take bread by the truckloads for the major bakers, and they say, make me a few truckloads a week or a day, or however they're manufacturing products, and that's considered a private label. So even though the hashgacha may be on the package, it could be that that specific plant does not have an arrangement that a Jewish person is lighting the fire. And those can still be considered pas paltar. That's what we spoke before about Stroman's and Freihofers, just an example of the national bread companies, that even though one specific plant could be made under a certain condition that a Jew is lighting the fire, that does not mean it's being done in all their plants. So if you go into a supermarket and you want to be concerned and only have pas Israel, the chances are of those products are in fact considered pas paltar and not pas Israel. Shavuos is around the corner, and many people have the custom of eating dairy. And I know the rabbi is going to be speaking about the topic of hard cheese over Shavuos, so I don't want to ruin the entire lecture, so we're just going to speak about it for a minute or two. The question is regarding hard cheese and waiting 6 hours. In order to understand the halachas of waiting 6 hours, you really have to just backtrack and have a short introduction. The halachas of waiting 6 hours really come from the Gemara. And the Talmud says that really, if you have meat and then you want to have dairy, you don't have to wait anything at all. All you have to do, according to Tosfos and earlier commentaries, is you wash your mouth out, you wash your hands, and you can have your dairy. However, the Rambam Maimonides says you have to wait 6 hours. He doesn't use the language of 6 hours. He says Kamoi Sheisho. He says like 6 hours. And that's why, like we mentioned before, Chacham Avad Yosef, he maintains that you don't have to wait exactly 6 hours. You can wait in the 5th hour. Many in fact, do have the custom of waiting 5 hours or 5.5 hours. Two reasons are given for the custom. One is Rashi and one is the Rambam. Rashi says that the taste of meat will linger in your mouth for up to 6 hours, and that's why you would have to wait the 6 hour period. The Rambam maintains that there might be a piece of meat stuck in your mouth for up to 6 hours, and until that 6 hour passes, it has the status of meat, and after 6 hour passes, it's not considered meat anymore. The Aruch HaShulchan, there's another commentary, lived about 100 years ago, he maintains that God forbid to even be lenient on this, and the 6 hour period is what is required after meat before you have dairy. What about eating dairy and then having meat? So if we just finished speaking about meat and then eating dairy, you don't have to wait anything. So from dairy to meat, you wouldn't have to wait anything at all. There are commentaries brought down in Code of Jewish Law, chapter 89, that maintains that you have to wait an hour. But we just finished saying there are many earlier commentaries that say you don't have to wait anything from meat to dairy. So if you want to have dairy to meat, you wouldn't have to wait anything either. But there is a custom of many to wait a half hour. From dairy to meat. Where does this custom come from? Many people say it's a compromise between those who say you have to wait an hour and those who say that only a half hour is required or nothing is required. So in order to understand where the half hour came from, they maintain that it's a compromise between those two opinions. Those that say you have to wait an hour and those that say you don't have to wait anything. Getting to the question of hard cheese, just like we said we have to wait 6 hours for meat, the commentaries say that hard cheese has a component in it that has a very strong flavor. And that very strong flavor requires somebody to wait the same amount of time he does when he waits after meat, whether it's 5 hours or 5.5 hours in the 5th hour or the complete 6 hours. There is an opinion of the Yad Yehuda that maintains that if it's melted, you wouldn't have to wait 6 hours. And there are other such details that require 6 hour waiting period in certain types of cheeses, but we'll leave that up to Shavuos night. This gives you a very good reason to come to the Rabbi's Shir, to hear the end of the shir on hard cheese. Many women call me up and they're cooking in the kitchen and they have peeled eggs and garlic. And they want to know if they can leave it overnight or they have to just throw it out. The halacha is brought down in the Code of Jewish Law in chapter 116, and obviously it's brought down in the Talmud in the Seftas Nida. And there they say that you should not take eggs, garlic, and onions and leave it overnight. Luckily, we have Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein wrote in his responsa that called the Igros Moshe. And the question came up, if you go to a grocery store and you buy in the package already made peeled garlic, how is that permitted? We just finished saying you're not allowed to have peeled eggs, garlic, and onions left overnight. And those are left over many nights. Those are made weeks and months in advance. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said the whole issue is if a housewife decides to leave over eggs, garlic, and onion overnight. But if it's meant for commercial purposes, if it's made by certain manufacturing companies, it would not be an issue, and therefore many people go to supermarkets and they do see the garlic with a certification on it, they do see eggs chopped up left overnight, and the reason for that is because it was only meant to be a housewife as a knas or as a penalty, but for a commercial purposes there will be no issue. There are ways for a housewife to get around the issue of having eggs and garlic and onions left overnight, and that is if you add some oil or other ingredients like salt to the mix. If you want to make a salad and you want to have those items and leave it in the fridge, as long as you add something else to the eggs, garlic, and onions and you leave it overnight, such as oil or salt, that would permit the usage of those items, and you'll be able to have them overnight as well. Memorial Day is coming up, even though it doesn't feel like that outside because it's very rainy and it's not barbecue season per se. But many people have a question that comes up regarding barbecue sauce. What do I mean by barbecue sauce? Because many barbecue sauces contain anchovies. And the Talmud says in Masechet Pesachim, Tractate Pesachim, that you're not allowed to take fish and meat together. You can't cook fish and meat together. It's a danger to do so. The rabbis say that it's a danger for some reason. They don't get into details, but they say it's a danger. There are earlier commentaries that say that it really only applies to fish and milk, and that's why many Sephardim, people who are from Sephardic descent, don't have a cream cheese sandwich with lox, because they say that really it means fish and milk and not fish and meat. And these laws are codified in Code of Jewish Law, chapter 87. It's brought down by the commentaries there on the side of the Shulchan Aruch, of the Code of Jewish Law. And there they say that really for Ashkenazim it's fish and meat. And the law is that you're not allowed to cook fish and meat together. How are you allowed to take these barbecue sauces that have anchovies on them? And the sauce that I'm referring to is Worcestershire sauce. It says in the container anchovies. You would not be able to use that with your meat dishes on the barbecue. However, there are Kashrut agencies that do give certification on them. And the reason for that is because there are earlier commentaries that maintain that if you have the fish in the sauce and it's nullified by 60%, then there's no concern. And that's why you'll have a certification on the bottle and it won't have any indication of fish on the bottle because the anchovies are so minute and so minimal that there's no concern. But when you will see a Worcestershire sauce and it'll have the words fish on there, that's the sauce that you should not be using together with your meat because the anchovies in there are a very high volume and very high percentage. We spoke briefly about lettuce and bugs, that there are many transgressions that you could possibly transgress when you have lettuce and the bugs that could be common in such items, and therefore it's always recommended to buy the lettuce, romaine lettuce, which has a certification, or if you want to wash the lettuce, there are ways to wash the lettuce as well, and many of the kosher agencies and the Kof K especially have on their website, you can download a bug guide which will direct you on the correct manner of how to wash such vegetables as lettuce and strawberries